Just weeks ago, on January 9th, 2022, two Emirates 777s carrying up to 700 people nearly collided on the runway at Dubai International Airport. This was seconds away from becoming perhaps the worst air crash in history. But how did this happen in the first place? How did two massive aircraft, operated by one of the world's most trusted airlines, come just seconds away from collision, killing hundreds of people on board? The answer, which appears to be emerging, is shocking. Reports indicate that one of the aircraft began to take off without having received takeoff clearance. If true, this raises serious questions about what went on in the cockpit of the departing aircraft. How could a pair of highly trained pilots, flying one of the world's most modern passenger aircraft, make such a simple mistake? In light of other recent close calls at Emirates, including another near disaster at Dubai just last month, this incident raises further questions about the safety culture at Emirates Airlines. At just before 9 o'clock in the evening local time, on Sunday, January 9th this year, Emirates Flight 524 pushed back from Terminal 3 of Dubai International Airport. It was bound for Hyderabad in India, a 3.5-hour journey. On board were two pilots and as many as 356 passengers. At the same time, on the other side of the terminal, another aircraft was pushing back. This was Emirates Flight 568, another Boeing 777, carrying as much as 354 passengers. This aircraft was bound for Bengaluru in India, also a 3.5-hour journey. These aircraft both began taxiing to runway 30 right, which was being used by departing aircraft at Dubai. At first, the aircraft were taxiing in opposite directions, with the Bengaluru-bound flight heading northwest for its taxi to the runway, and the Hyderabad flight heading southeast. Nobody on board either plane knew it yet, but in a few short minutes, they would meet again, ending up a lot closer than was ever intended. The weather on this night was perfect for flying. The sky was clear, there was little wind, and the visibility was more than 10 kilometers. As each aircraft taxied to the runway, the pilots were busy completing their before takeoff checklists. They were also paying close attention to the taxiway signage outside of their aircraft, making sure that they were following the route to the runway that air traffic control had assigned them. Dubai is a sprawling airport with a complex tapestry of taxiways and two busy runways. Pilots must take care to navigate correctly. As Flight 524 approached runway 30 left, it stopped short of the runway and waited for a landing aircraft to pass by. It then received permission from air traffic control to cross the runway and continue its taxi to the parallel runway, runway 30 right, which it was to depart from. The language that air traffic controllers and pilots use is highly standardized and has been honed over decades of accidents and close calls. The emphasis is on reducing the chances of a misunderstanding, as this can and has been fatal. For example, because communication is over the radio, and because radio is often far from crystal clear, the number 9 can sound like the number 5. To avoid the possibility of a pilot or controller mishearing a 9 as a 5, or vice versa, the word niner is used instead of 9. As in, Emirates 789 would be Emirates 789er. Some other phraseology is more clunky, but is similarly vital for safety. In Europe, when controllers tell pilots to wait until another aircraft has landed before they enter the runway for takeoff themselves, they say, for example, Ryanair 358, behind landing traffic, line up and wait behind. This repetition of the word behind, and its inclusion at both the start and the end of the transmission, makes it far less likely that the communication will be misheard. In this case, it reduces the chances that the plane waiting for takeoff will enter the runway before the landing aircraft touches down. This emphasis on clarity is worth keeping in mind, given the events which are about to unfold here. As Flight 524 approached the runway, Flight 568 was about 2,000 metres down the runway, approaching it at taxiway November 4. Its plan was to cross the runway here, then to turn right and taxi alongside it until it reached the start of the runway. At 4 minutes past 9, Flight 524 received permission from air traffic control to enter the runway. This is not permission to take off, however. That must be received separately. At this point, the air traffic controller cleared Flight 568 to cross the runway. However, as Flight 568 began crossing the runway, the unthinkable happened. Emirates Flight 524 started accelerating down the runway. The pilots had started to take off without permission from air traffic control. As it accelerated past a speed of 100 knots, or 185 kilometers an hour, the air traffic controller saw what was about to happen. He shouted at the aircraft to stop, and just over 1,500 meters from impact, the pilot slammed on the brakes and brought the aircraft to a stop. Disaster was narrowly avoided. What happened next, however, was almost more incredible. Despite nearly being involved in what could well have been the worst air crash in history, the pilots of Flight 524 simply turned off the runway, let the brakes cool off for half an hour, then returned to the runway and took off. They continued their flight all the way to Hyderabad as normal. Under these circumstances, the expected course of action would have been to return to the gate, report the incident to the airline, and then leave the aircraft for another crew to take over. Instead, the pilots flew all the way to their destination as if nothing had happened. In doing this, the cockpit voice recorder was overwritten, as it only records in a 2-hour loop. This means that we'll never know exactly what was said in the cockpit that night. However, this does not mean that we're completely in the dark as to what happened. While the cockpit voice recording may no longer exist, the air traffic control tapes do. These can confirm without a shadow of a doubt what was said by the pilots and the controller over the radio that night. And early reports indicate that Emirates Flight 524 never received takeoff clearance. In 1977, a nearly identical mistake on the island of Tenerife took the lives of 583 people in what remains to this day the worst air crash in history. With perhaps as much as 700 people on board these two planes, this incident could have been even worse. The natural question then is why two qualified pilots could make such a simple mistake as to take off without clearance. The fact that there were two pilots is worth stressing here. Either pilot can stop a takeoff for any reason. How did both pilots fail to notice that they were never cleared for takeoff? One possibility goes back to something I mentioned earlier regarding the standard radio phraseology used between pilots and controllers. There are only two times that a tower controller will use the word cleared, at takeoff and at landing. An aircraft can be cleared for takeoff or cleared for landing, but the word cleared is never used for anything else near a runway. When a controller wants to tell an aircraft to cross a runway, they will say, for example, Emirates 568 cross runway 30 right. It's possible that in this case, the controller mistakenly used the word cleared, as in Emirates 568 cleared to cross runway 30 right, and the pilots of Flight 524 mistakenly thought that they were receiving their takeoff clearance. We don't know this yet, as the tapes have not been made public. However, even if the controller did use the word cleared, that doesn't explain how the pilots of Flight 524 missed the next part of the transmission, where the controller said, to cross runway 30 right. That should be unambiguous, surely. Yet, it may not have been. Consider the following scenario. You're at the controls of Flight 524, making your way to the runway that night. As a long-haul pilot, you're jet-lagged, you're fatigued, and you're busily completing the final few items on your checklists as you line up with the runway. You're expecting to hear the controller's voice at any moment, clearing you for takeoff. As you're completing your before takeoff checks, you hear the controller's voice. Emirates 5 something something, clear to something, runway 30 right. With your attention being focused on your immediate surroundings, your mind doesn't quite parse what the controller is saying. Emirates 5 something something, that has to be you. Clear to cross, clear takeoff, they sound pretty similar. Runway 30 right, that's your runway. Without listening carefully, you could easily conclude that you had just received your takeoff clearance. It's easy to see how, given the right circumstances, a runway crossing clearance can be misheard as a takeoff clearance. In fact, even if the controller avoided using the word cleared, it's still possible that the pilot just heard a call sign that sounded like his own, and the runway he was on, and filled in the rest himself. Playing a key role in this scenario is a recognized psychological phenomenon known as expectation bias, which we've covered before on this channel. Expectation bias occurs when we see what we expect to see, or hear what we expect to hear, rather than seeing or hearing what is actually occurring. Research has shown that we're more likely to fall prey to this effect when we're stressed or tired, which is quite likely to have been the case for the pilots on this flight. Did this pilot hear what he was expecting to hear, rather than what was actually said? If so, why didn't the other pilots step in and question whether this clearance was actually received? If this incident is like others of its kind, it's quite possible that the other pilot did step in, but that he was overruled. This is exactly what happened in the 1977 collision in Tenerife. However, we don't have the full details yet, and this is just one possibility. In all this, however, there's still something that doesn't make sense. For every instruction an air traffic controller gives, the pilots must give a so-called readback, where they repeat what the controller says to confirm that they understand the instructions. A typical takeoff clearance goes as follows. The controller says, Emirates 123, winds calm, cleared for takeoff, runway 30 right. And the pilot says, clear for takeoff 30 right, Emirates 123. In the case of Emirates Flight 524, if the pilots thought that they had received clearance for takeoff, they would have read this back to the air traffic controller, and the controller would have told them immediately that he did not give them clearance for takeoff. It appears that in this case, this readback never happened. Without having the results of an official investigation, we can't know for sure what took place here, but one way of explaining this lack of a readback is that as the pilots of Flight 524 lined up with the runway, one of them may have had the controller's instruction to line up still playing in his head, and may have misremembered it as a takeoff clearance. Takeoff clearances are often given when planes are still holding short of the runway, and so the pilot may have been acting almost on muscle memory, simply acting out what he had done 1,000 times before, which is lining up with the runway and taking off. Again, the presence of two pilots should have prevented this, and that's the underlying problem in all of the scenarios presented here. All of these scenarios centre around a serious lack of teamwork in the cockpit, or what is known as crew resource management. Whatever the final report into this incident uncovers, it's highly likely that this will be a key finding. Given the spate of close calls at Emirates in recent years, including one as recent as December 2021, it's reasonable to speculate that this incident may be a symptom of a broader problem in the pilot training culture at Emirates Airlines. A takeoff clearance is one of the most crucial clearances an aircraft can receive, and it's highly unlikely that one would be misheard by two pilots independently. It's much more likely that there were serious deficiencies in crew resource management in this cockpit. In a video I made about last month's close call at Dubai, I asked whether Emirates would be so lucky the next time an incident happened. This time, the answer appears to be yes, but unless things are changed, it may not be long before their luck runs out. Special thanks to the members of this channel for helping make this video possible. I'd especially like to thank users EUK95 and Andrew Shaishkalov for their extremely generous contributions. If you'd like to support the channel and get perks like early access to videos or voting on future episodes, please click the join button. I've also started a Patreon, which is linked here. Thanks again for watching.